Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Biblical Bookworm. My name is Elizabeth, and today I'll be talking about the book The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. I'll start with telling you a little bit of background about the author. So, Lee Strobel was an atheist journalist who studied journalism and law and converted to Christianity at the age of 29 in 1981. It all started when his wife converted to Christianity in 1979 because that made Lee Strobel start an investigation surrounding the facts that support Christianity. There's also a movie about this book where he tries to disprove his wife, although I'm not sure if that actually happened because he didn't mention that in the book that he tried to disprove his wife. I only know that he started his research because she converted to Christianity. The evidence that made him convert back then is similar to the research that he did for this book, although it's not the same, because he said that he didn't plan to make his research a book. He converted to Christianity in 1981, and the book was published in 1998, so that's almost 20 years in between. But he says that that's similar, that what he did for the book. In this book, he interviews experts, namely theologians, biblical scholars, Christian apologists, an archaeologist, a psychologist, a doctor, and philosophers. And as the resurrection of Jesus is crucial for the Christian faith, the whole book is centered around evidence for it. Because if Jesus claimed to be God and said that he would rise from the dead and then actually did so, that would be a pretty strong case for Christ. So let's start with the content of the book. Can the biographers of Jesus be trusted? The first question that Lee Strobel tackled was how we know that the Gospels were actually written by the evangelists and not someone else. First, no one else claimed to be the author, and no one had an interest for the four evangelists to be the actual authors, as they weren't that special. Mark and Luke weren't even part of the 12 apostles, and Matthew was an unpopular tax collector. Also, the apocryphal writings were prescribed to famous people like Mary, St. Peter, and St. Jacob. Only with John, it's not certain what John it was who wrote the Gospel of John, but it's sure that it was some John. The conclusion that he draws from this is that if we know that the four evangelists were the actual authors of the Gospels, we know that the Gospels are based on direct or indirect eyewitness accounts. For those informations, he interviewed I think he was a theologian, Dr. Blomberg, and another question that he asked him in that interview was, as the Gospel of John is the oldest one, maybe he embellished the whole story and invented that Jesus claimed to be God, because John says very explicitly that Jesus claimed to be God. But Dr. Blomberg says that the synoptics confirm that, although it might not be that direct. For example, he says that in Matthew 14:27, Jesus says, "Fear not, for it is I," in most English translations, but in the Greek original, he says, "I am." And those two words are identical to what Jesus said in John 8:58 when he took upon himself the divine name I am, which is the way God revealed himself to Moses in the Old Testament in Exodus 3:14. Then Lee Strobel brings up the question that Jesus' most common title for himself in the first three Gospels is Son of Man. And he asked the question whether that does mean that Jesus viewed himself as only human. Dr. Blomberg answers that that's not the case because the Son of Man is actually a divine figure from the Old Testament. In Daniel 7:13-14, it says, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days, and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." So by calling himself Son of Man, Jesus actually claims to be God. Then Mr. Strobel also objects that as the Gospels were written decades after Jesus' death, what if those were just legends that developed after Jesus' death? Dr. Blomberg again says that 3 decades was still within the lifespan of the eyewitnesses. So if people would have seen that there are fake news, they would have protested. And Dr. Blomberg also compares the New Testament to other ancient texts, like, for example, the biographies of Alexander the Great, which were written 400 years after his death, but are generally trusted. Were Jesus' biographies reliably preserved for us? How do we know, for example, that within the time of, let's say, those 3 decades, the evangelists didn't just forget parts of the story and made up others? According to Dr. Blomberg, people back then were trained to memorize more. For example, the rabbis knew the whole Old Testament by heart. And also we have to keep in mind that 80 to 90% of Jesus' words were originally in poetic form, which doesn't mean that the stuff rhymed, but those texts had balanced lines, parallelisms, and so forth, which helped to memorize those texts. And also, what Dr. Blomberg pointed out was that those oral stories usually varied in 10 to 40% in their content, which is interestingly the exact amount the synoptics vary among each other. There were also always fixed points that were unalterable, and the community that listened to the storyteller had the right to intervene and correct him if he erred on those important aspects of the story. Then Mr. Strobel raises the question whether there are passages in the New Testament that could have been left out if the Gospels were made up, because those passages would have been confusing or embarrassing. And there actually are embarrassing or confusing passages in the Gospels. For example, when Jesus on the cross says, "Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" Or the baptism of Jesus. And also in Mark 6:5, it says that Jesus could do few miracles in Nazareth because the people there had little faith, which seems to limit Jesus' power. And Jesus also said in Mark 13:32 that he didn't know the day or the hour of his return, which seemed to limit his omniscience. So those were examples that show us that if the Bible would have been made up, or the New Testament was made up, those passages could have been just left out, and it would have been way easier to leave them out than to explain them afterwards. The next question is whether the Gospels were preserved. And that's a question Lee Strobel asked in an interview with Dr. Metzger, a biblical scholar. And Dr. Metzger says that there are extremely many early copies and translations of the New Testament, around 5,000 Greek manuscripts, which is more than any other ancient document. The document with the second most Greek manuscripts is Homer's Iliad, with only 650 manuscripts. Dr. Metzger also points out that even if we lost all the Greek manuscripts and the early translations, we could still reproduce the content of the New Testament from the multiplicity of quotations, commentaries, sermons, letters, and so forth of the early church fathers. After that, Mr. Strobel utters his skepticism about the selection of the texts that became the canon of the New Testament. Because how do we know that the right texts were chosen and not just the ones that fit the narrative? Dr. Metzger then named the 3 criteria all books of the New Testament had to meet. And he says, quote, "First, the book must have apostolic authority. That is, they must have been written either by apostles themselves, who were eyewitnesses to what they wrote, or by followers of the apostles. Second, there was the criterion of conformity to what was called the rule of faith. That is, was the document congruent with the basic Christian tradition that the church recognized as normative? And third, there was the criterion of whether a document had had continuous acceptance and usage by the church at large." Consequently, Dr. Metzger makes the point that the books weren't chosen and then became authoritative, but they were authoritative and then became chosen. He compares the declaration of the official canon with declaring that Beethoven was a good composer. He says that everyone knew it beforehand, but then it became official. Is there mention of Jesus outside of Christian sources? In the third interview, Lee Strobel asked the historian and Christian apologist Dr. Yamucho whether there were sources outside of the Bible that mention Jesus and what we would know about Jesus if we didn't have the New Testament, but only sources such as Josephus, the Talmud, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, and others. Dr. Yamuchi answers, quote, "We would know that first, Jesus was a Jewish teacher. Second, many people believe that he performed healings and exorcisms. Third, some people believe that he was the Messiah. Fourth, he was rejected by the Jewish leaders. Fifth, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. Sixth, despite of his shameful death, his followers who believed that he was still alive spread beyond Palestine, so that there were multitudes of them in Rome by AD 64. And seventh, all kinds of people from the cities and countryside, men and women, slave and free, worshipped him as God." Mr. Strobel also asks the archaeologist Dr. McRae whether the Gospels are accurate in their historical and geographical description, because if they are not accurate, that would make the rest of the accounts less credible. In short, what Dr. McRae tells Mr. Strobel is that the Gospels are accurate in their depiction of the historical and geographical circumstances, and there have been cases where scholars actually initially believed that, for example, Luke was wrong in some references, but later discoveries confirmed that he was actually right. In another chapter, the author interviews the psychologist Dr. Douglas whether Jesus was crazy when he claimed to be God. And Dr. Douglas explains that a sign that someone is insane are not only words, but inappropriate emotions. Jesus didn't show inappropriate emotions. For example, he cried when his friend Lazarus died and was angry when injustice happened in the temple, which are both normal reactions according to Dr. Douglas. Jesus also wasn't out of touch with reality. He talked rationally and he could connect with his surroundings emotionally. Dr. Douglas concludes that Jesus truly believed that he was God and that Jesus wasn't crazy. Lee Strobel then suggests the possibility that the miraculous healings were due to the placebo effect. And Dr. Douglas states that indeed part of the miracles might have been placebos, but there was also evidence for miraculous healings, as Dr. Douglas says that psychosomatic healing takes time, but Jesus healed spontaneously, and he healed also blindness, leprosy, and raised someone from the dead, which is not explicable psychosomatically. But for Dr. Douglas, interestingly, Jesus' most divine act were not the miracles, as many others have also performed miracles, but that he forgave sins. Did Jesus fulfill the attributes of God? Jesus fulfilled the attributes of God, for example, omniscience in John 16:30. The Apostle John affirms of Jesus, "Now we can see that you know all things." Omnipresence, Jesus said in Matthew 28:20, "Surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." And in Matthew 18:20, "Where two or three come together in my name, there I am with them." Omnipotence, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me," Jesus said in Matthew 28:18. Eternality, in John 1:1, declares Jesus, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Immutability, in Hebrews 13:8, it says, "Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever." Did Jesus, and only Jesus, match the identity of the Messiah? In an interview with the Jewish convert to Christianity, Louis Lapidus, they discuss whether Jesus and Jesus alone match the identity of the Messiah. Someone did the math and figured out that the probability of just 8 prophecies being fulfilled is 1 chance in 100 million billion. Mr. Lapidus names the example of such fulfilled prophecies in Isaiah 53:3-9. Mr. Strobel also interviewed a doctor for his book, Dr. Metherell, who explains in detail why it was impossible for Jesus to survive the crucifixion, and that even if Jesus had survived, he would have been barely able to walk after his crucifixion. So there was no way that he survived the crucifixion and then appeared to his disciples, because they would have noticed that he didn't look glorious at all. Finally, Mr. Strobel asked the theologian and Christian apologist Dr. Moreland for 5 pieces of circumstantial evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. First, the disciples died for their beliefs. Lee Strobel objects that the same is true for other religions. According to Dr. Moreland, the difference is that, quote, Muslims might be willing to die for their belief that Allah revealed himself to Muhammad, but this revelation was not done in a publicly observable way, so they could be wrong about it. They may sincerely think it's true, but they can't know for a fact because they didn't witness it themselves. However, the apostles were willing to die for something they had seen with their own eyes and touched with their own hands. People will die for their religious beliefs if they sincerely believe they're true, but people won't die for their religious beliefs if they know their beliefs are false. The conversion of skeptics is the second argument for the resurrection of Jesus, because skeptics like St. Paul, for example, or Saul initially, didn't want to become Christians, but they actually still converted. Mr. Strobel objects that that would mean that the conversion of Muhammad is evidence that Jesus did not rise from the dead. But Dr. Moreland replies that it is not the case, because Muhammad's conversion happened when he went into a cave and had a religious experience there, while early followers of Jesus claim to have seen events that happened outside of their heads and that were seen by other people as well. The third argument are the changes to key social structures. Again, a quote from Dr. Moreland. At the time of Jesus, the Jews had been persecuted for 700 years by the Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, and now by the Greeks and the Romans. However, we still see Jews today, where we don't see Hittites, Perizzites, Ammonites, Assyrians, Persians, and Babylonians, and other people who had been living at that time. Why? Because these people got captured by other nations, intermarried, and lost their national identity. The question is, why didn't that happen to the Jews? And the answer is because the things that make the Jews Jews, the social structures that gave them their national identity, were unbelievably important to them. Now, a rabbi named Jesus appears from a lower class region. He teaches for 3 years, gathers a following of lower and middle class people, gets in trouble with the authorities, and gets crucified along with 30,000 other Jewish men who were executed during this time period. But 5 weeks after he's crucified, over 10,000 Jews are following him and claiming that he is the initiator of a new religion. And get this, they're willing to give up all their social institutions that they have been taught since childhood. The fourth argument for the resurrection of Jesus is the fact that communion and baptism exist and what those sacraments mean. Dr. Moreland says that, quote, what's odd is that these early followers of Jesus didn't get together to celebrate his teachings or how wonderful he was. They came together regularly to have a celebrational meal for one reason, to remember that Jesus had been publicly slaughtered in a grotesque and humiliating way. He then names the example of John F. Kennedy. He says that it's understandable if people would remember his confrontation with Russia, his promotion of civil rights, and his charismatic personality, but no one would go around and celebrate the fact that he was murdered. And baptism is the same thing again, because with baptism we celebrate the death of Jesus just as communion. By going under the water, you are celebrating his death. And by being brought out of the water, you're celebrating the fact that Jesus was raised to life. And the last evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, according to Dr. Moreland, is the emergence of the church. He says that if you asked a Martian looking down at the first century and would ask him what he thought would survive Christianity or the Roman Empire, no one would have put his money on a ragtag group of people whose primary message was that a crucified carpenter from an obscure village had triumphed over the grave. Yet it was so successful that today we name our children Peter and Paul and our dogs Caesar and Nero. Now, let's get to my opinion on the book. For the sake of this video, I actually watched a couple of atheist YouTube videos where they share their objections that they have against this book. And one thing that a couple of atheists mentioned was that the book isn't written for atheists, but for Christians in order to confirm their beliefs. And I would disagree with the latter part, because I don't think that the book is written for Christians in order to confirm their beliefs, because I doubt that the average Christian asks themselves whether Jesus actually existed. I don't think that that's a question that Christians ask themselves. I mean, I can imagine that Catholics wonder whether the Holy Communion is actually the blood and body of Christ, but I would say that the book was rather written for people who allow for the possibility that there is a God. For example, open-minded agnostics, or people who believe in some sort of deity but are not sure what religion, or they doubt that it's any religion, any organized religion. Because of course it will be possible to still doubt every piece of evidence that Mr. Strobel talks about in his book, as if one does not accept the possibility that there could be a God, and every miracle that happened could be tried to be explained away in a natural way, although that explanation would be less probable than if one just accepted that there is a God. And then, of course, a very common objection is that Lee Strobel didn't ask any non-Christian experts. He only asked biblical scholars, theologians, and Christian psychologists, and so on. But I agree with that. That might have been better. But the fact is that if he had asked atheist experts, there still would have been Christian apologists that would have had an answer. And then again, there would have been atheists that have an answer. So in the end, I believe it's just a matter of trust, what side you trust, what sounds more rational to you. And so I don't think that it was that necessary for Mr. Strobel to include more arguments from atheists. I would give the book, I guess, an 8.5 out of 10. It was a very easy read, so that's why it's a pretty high number. It was pretty interesting to read, but the fact that he did not interview any atheists did bother me a little bit, and also some arguments were better than others. So I think it's just a question of preference. That's been it for today. See you next week. God bless, and hallelujah!